You're live. So welcome to Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Today's Psyfeld discussion will be on the conversion. Thoughts, characters?
I think George would be a good starting point.
Sure.
Since the episode kind of centers around him, where he initially, I think the episode kind of opens when he's at a restaurant having meeting with his current girlfriend, and the girlfriend kind of breaks down in terms of saying, "Oh, I can't, be in a relationship with you anymore because my parents disapprove because you're not, I think, Latvian Orthodox."
Yeah.
And throughout the episode, we see that George gets the idea from Elaine that you might want to convert because, it would be so romantic, even though that she's kidding. And he goes through the entire episode trying to actually convert to Latvian Orthodox, and actually ends up converting. But at the end of the scene, we see that she's gonna move to Latvia, and we'll maybe see each other again in a year.
Thoughts on what's going on here with George? Now, some background. In season 5, episode 10, previous episode, I don't recall meeting his girlfriend. So I'm not so sure this is a long-standing romance. If it is, there's a different dynamic. But I think it's somewhat reasonable to assume that George Costanza knows her for a matter of days. So what's going on here?
Dependent disorder.
Is that?
Dependent disorder.
So it could certainly be a dependent personality, right? So dependent personality is the individual. If you want to think of the hallmark, forgetting to actually memorize the diagnostic criteria, the cardinal sign is the individual who needs affirmation for their every next step. And then if you look at the DSM criteria, for which I believe you need 5, they're just like examples of that cardinal feature. And if you remember that, you then avoid having to memorize a whole bunch of clinical criteria, and you really know what to look for in your shelf exam and in clinical practice. This could be George, because we can certainly see that he has this pervasive need from Jerry to be affirmed. And that's almost every episode, over 9 seasons plus. You can look back at some history between the two ever since high school, so that could certainly be it.
I think him having a more superficial relationship that he feels is deeper is more cluster B.
Right. And again, I think the main teaching point here is that these groups or clusters are somewhat artificial. Right? They're created by authors, and when you cluster or when you group human behaviors together, there's always going to be some mistake, some error in this, because human behavior just doesn't work like that. So many, not only, a higher prevalence of individuals share characteristics within a cluster, but it doesn't preclude them from sharing characteristics between clusters, and that's what we see here. I think that's a main teaching point to take with you when you, again, go to your outpatient care, whether it's internal medicine, family practice, psychiatry. Anything else here?
Well, it's kind of amusing how George kind of goes so far in terms of converting, where he initially spends a lot of time studying in the bathroom in secret at his parents' house for like an hour on the toilet, and causing his parents to be like, "Why are you in there so long?" Then he comes to the realization that he's probably not going to pass, so he basically tries to cheat his way through the actual test. So I think it shows how different George is in terms of when we see him previously in other episodes where like he got the job and kind of just didn't do anything with reports. And now he's actually put in some effort, but at the tail end of it, he had to resort to cheating to get through it.
Yeah, again, very typical George. And in part, this is due to his being impulsive. He just quickly delves into this without thinking it through, and therefore finds himself in a position where he needs to cheat to accomplish his task. If this is well thought through, he may not actually go through with this. Just backtracking just a little bit, cluster C, cluster B, even cluster A, it doesn't matter. The general definition of a personality is fourfold. Right? Now, again, anyone can challenge this anytime because textbooks this thick have been written on personality disorders, each chapter given to a theory, right? The DSM has by far the most simple, of all definitions. And that is, a personality is made up of four major components: okay, cognition, interpersonal functioning, impulsivity, and affectivity. It's the four-part definition of a personality. In George's case, we actually see a significant deficit in one of those areas. I mean, more than one of those areas, but certainly the area that prompts the interpersonal dysfunction actually is impulsivity. So in this episode, 2 of the 4 areas are with significant deficit. And I think that's another major theme here, because if you carry that to your outpatient practice, when individuals present to you for their glucose check or for a follow-up of their headache or whatever it is, if they're showing you deficits in any of those 4 domains, you may actually have screened positive for a general personality disorder, and that's the clinician's prompt to now get into which particular disorder might I be experiencing, okay? And that's when you look at clusters A, B, and C. That's what's going on with George here. He's quite impulsive, okay? And that leads directly to interpersonal dysfunction. So he hits 2 of those 4. To begin the diagnosis of a personality disorder, the individual must actually demonstrate deficits in 2 of the 4. Okay, so 1 of the 4, not quite there. 2 of the 4 domains, and you're on your way to diagnosing a personality disorder. The other part of this is, again, if you look at the etiology of personality development, therefore personality disorders, George Costanza we know the most about, because we know the most about, Mr. and Mrs. Costanza, no doubt. Okay, we see the Seinfelds as well, but we know the most about George's parents. In the same context, those early experiences that we are privy to do also demonstrate that George is not well rooted. Because if he was well rooted in his religion and spirituality, he may not be so impulsive to switch religions for someone he knows for a matter of days. So this all gets down to his actually having been less rooted, maybe even having a spiritual crisis.
I feel like she almost knows that, because towards the end, when she said she was leaving, she says like, I think she says, "George, don't you change," or something like that. Don't change who you are, or something, which is like very contrary, it's just contradictory to the fact that like he had changed based on impulse alone, and then she's telling him that you shouldn't change for anything.
I wonder what she was actually referring to. Don't change now that you are rooted in a firm religion, or don't change being that person who was so quick to change. I'm not so sure which way she meant. Of course, it doesn't matter what's George Costanza going to do. We have another 4 seasons left, or maybe 3.5 seasons left. We know that George Costanza isn't going to change his true colors in terms of being so impulsive.
Well, one thing I also realized in terms of when you're going back to the rooted aspect, I think why George latches onto the girlfriend so quickly is because I think talking to Jerry, he was like, this person doesn't care that I'm unemployed, I live with my parents. So I think that's like the rootedness that he wants, and in terms of a relationship, he doesn't care that he doesn't have, he lives with his parents still.
I agree. You made a comment before with regard to his studying. What was he studying? What were his parents' concerns? Again, tying this all together with regard to these early developmental experiences, and his not being well rooted, and his having some etiology, some origin of his personality disorder. This takes you back in terms of a quick glimpse as to what life may have been like for George Costanza as a child. And you could approach this twofold. So, what are his parents concerned about? Are they concerned that he's switching religions? When parents are banging on the door, what are you doing in there? What do they think their kid's doing? So number one, if you focus on the anal stage, right, psychosexual development of Sigmund Freud, he's toilet training. Okay? So that's number one. That's where things could have gone awry for him. And quite frankly, for George, I can't see toilet training having been successful. He's an anal expulsive, right? So he's the opposite of an individual who's anal retentive. And because of that, he and Jerry are kindred. And Jerry's the anal retentive. He's the obsessive compulsive personality. He's the type A personality. George, his best friend, is the opposite. Right? He's a slob. There's episodes that show this. So things could have gone awry with toiletry, right? Banging on the door. Of course, as an adolescent, also could be fixated, George, at the genital stage. And if that's the case, we know why his parents are banging on the door. Get out of there. What are you doing there? Why are you there so long? Okay, so it could be twofold, depending on when he experienced that trauma, and therefore when he is fixated, and therefore where he's regressing back to. All right. Anything else? Oh, he also, just before we leave George as a character, he references Brokcream in this episode, and this is a loose association, but Brokcream was actually sponsored by the late Mickey Mantle, okay? And from there, we won't do this morning, but we could certainly discuss Mickey Mantle in the context of different points, teaching points in psychiatry as well. Right? We'll do that later on today. He passed away from liver cirrhosis, secondary to chronic alcohol use. All right. Any other characters here?
Jerry, the whole issue with the funny side.
So what's going on with Jerry?
Jerry is dating a podiatrist, which also bothers him.
That's Elaine.
That's Elaine.
Oh, no, but who is the blonde girl? Isn't she a podiatrist too?
No,
No,
she's
she's
subletting. Subletting.
Oh, well, I thought she was a podiatrist too. Anyway, but she has a fungicide in her medicine cabinet that he finds. The medicine cabinet is like creaked open, so he thinks that he didn't actually open it, but he like opens it all the way and finds it, and then kind of freaks out, thinking like, how can he date this woman who has fungicide? Like, what is she using it for? And then they find out that it's for the cat. But he like goes so far as to like steal it, and he looks to see if the tube has her name on it or the previous owner's, or the subletter's name on it.
So if, in a loose way, Jerry becomes fixated on an infection. So what parallel does this have in psychiatry?
Illness, anxiety.
It could be illness anxiety disorder, right? So illness anxiety disorder is part of the somatic symptom and related disorders. Specifically, it's a related disorder. It's a preoccupation syndrome. And I think that's important to remember because there are 3 major preoccupation syndromes outlined in the DSM. The preoccupation for the individual with illness anxiety disorder, previously known as hypochondriasis, is that they are focused on having a serious disease, despite evidence to the contrary. What are the other 2 preoccupation syndromes? That is, the 2 syndromes in the DSM where the actual word preoccupation describes the nature of the relationship.
Eating disorders.
Eating disorders, right? So that's preoccupation with body shape, body image. And one more major one, when an individual has a preoccupation with having an imagined defect in appearance that is not body image. Body dysmorphia disorder. Good. So there's your 3 preoccupation syndromes. What else is in your differential diagnosis? Let's say that the individual presents with an apparent preoccupation and is presented evidence to the contrary and demonstrates 0 insight. That is, there's no flexibility and the belief is rigid. Might you change the terminology in describing that fixed belief now? It's a delusion. And once that happens, what might any of these conditions, let's say hypochondriasis or body dysmorphic disorder, be relabeled as? Delusional disorder. Okay? So the differential between delusional disorder and any of the preoccupation syndromes is at the level of the belief. If the belief or the thought is not fixed, you're going to call it a preoccupation. Or in the case of OCD, obsession. And those 2 terms are interchangeable. We just choose one over the other depending on which illness we're describing, because the DSM uses one, either one. On the other hand, if it is fixed, we call it a delusion. Now we're in the realm of diagnosing a delusional disorder. What are the 5 themes or subtypes of delusional disorder?
Paranoid.
Paranoid or persecutory.
Ideas of reference.
Ideas of reference are a specific type of delusion not a subtype. So it's type, not a subtype. Erotomatic, good. What's erotomatic?
Believing that others are in love with you.
Right. What movie? Movie where, and the individual, who's the object, is usually of higher stature than the individual with the fixed belief. So this is someone who is rich and famous, who has always been admired by afar, and has always had his work interpreted by the proband, by the index case, as especially for her. One day he gets into a motor vehicle accident and she saves his life.
Misery.
It's misery. Right? Now, in the true sense, I'm giving away another question coming up, but it's really mixed type. Because not only is there erotomanic or erotomania in misery, but there is also the next subtype, grandiosity, because she speaks directly to God. So there's a mixed type there. So grandiose is another one.
Jealous?
Jealous type, good. And the final one is somatic. Okay. Now there are 3 different subgroups of somatic delusions, one of which happens to be infestation. And I think that's what's demonstrated here. The other word you'll usually see in the literature with regard to delusion disorder, somatic type, specifically infestation, is called delusional parapsychosis. It's the other one. Okay. And that's seen in multiple films, even in The Matrix, when he believes he has a bug in him. All right. Any other character here? The only other thing I picked up on was Kramer's innate ability to attract others. Kavorka. This parallels very nicely with the glamour of the vampire. And I didn't want to let that go because the vampire is a theme that we focus on in our curriculum. What do you know about the origins of the vampire? And to what extent are those origins rooted in psychiatry? Origins of the vampire?
Albinism.
Huh?
Albinism and fear of those who are albino.
Okay.
Sort of function.
There are several medical conditions that are thought to originate, and therefore the interpreted individuals were sequestered.
Porphyria.
Porphyria is another one. Mm-hmm. None of them really stood up with regard to in-depth kind of medical scrutiny, but there were many that were discussed. So the origins of the vampire probably, I think for the most part, there's at least 3 things. We're not going to discuss all 3 things right now. Again, if later on this afternoon, if we have a lull, I'm more than happy to give you this background. But the one I want to mention is the biography of Vlad Tepes, right? Otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler, who had some pretty well-documented strategies with regard to psychological torture. Right. Many believe he was afflicted with the antisocial personality disorder, and his real-life character was a major inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Having said that, we know that in the novel, in Bram Stoker's original novel, a lawyer, Parker, is imprisoned in the castle when he goes to the estate to close it. And this then sets the theme for the cardinal feature of antisocial personality, which is a blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights. So the vampire is the sine qua non, the actual paragon of an individual who blatantly disregards others' rights and safety, and that is the cardinal feature of the antisocial personality disorder. So, loose association, but, and we'll leave it there. Kind of brings us full circle. This is where we started the conversation, focusing on the personality disorders, and we'll end it here today. Friday we'll come back 9 o'clock. I will tweet the Seinfeld episode, and we are discussing films this afternoon at 12:30. We'll be back on Periscope. What films have we watched?
Sinister.
Did we cover all 3? Anybody here watch Paranormal Activity? we have, okay, we're covered. Sinister, covered, and insidious, we're good, we're looking good. So, all right, have a great morning rounds, we'll see you back here at 12:30.